Hi, everybody. I hope you're doing well wherever you are around the world. Excited to kick off our second webinar here. This is the second of 6 KSJ science editing webinars from the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. My name is Joshua Hatch, and I'll be your host today. I'm a former Night Science Journalism Fellow and the editor of the KSJ Science Editing Handbook, which is the basis for the webinars you'll hear about more in a moment. These webinars are held monthly on a variety of topics. Our first one was last month, and if you missed it, you can see it at ksjhandbook.org/live. And they are an extension of this recently published online science editing handbook, which you can find at also ksjhandbook.org. So I encourage you to visit where you can read the handbook in its entirety. You can read it online, download it as a PDF, and hopefully soon we'll have some additional translations available. Both this handbook, I should advance my screen, I'm sorry. So there you can see the site and the URL. So both this handbook and the webinar series are made possible and made free to you thanks to support from the Kavli Foundation and the Howard Hughes Medical Institute's Department of Science Education. And they are an outgrowth of a several years long set of Kavli supported in-person science editing workshops. Obviously with COVID, we've gone online, and it's been great because we've had really been able to reach hundreds and hundreds of people around the world. So we're really pleased to be bringing this to a much bigger audience. And I really want to give a huge thank you to Kavli and HHMI. Thanks also to everybody at the KSJ Fellowship at MIT, which is hosting these webinars, and to SciCommX, which is helping to produce them. So today's webinar is going to run about 90 minutes. And in a moment, I'm going to introduce our 3 really wonderful panelists, each of whom will talk for roughly 15 minutes, and then we'll move swiftly into a Q&A session. If you are participating on Zoom, you can use the QA button to send in questions, which we'll be monitoring, and we'll pull questions out to pose to the panelists, and we'll also try to answer as much as we can in the chat. There's both the QA and the chat, and we'll be in both. If you want to live tweet the webinar, you are welcome to do so. You can ask questions via Twitter. We'll try and follow those. You can use the hashtag KSJ Science Editing. You can also tag the panelists with the handles, as you can see here. And feel free to let others know that they can follow along at the link on the screen, which is ksjhandbook.org/live. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on that ksjhandbook.org site sometime soon. In fact, immediately following. And for those on Zoom, if you attend at least an hour of this webinar, you'll receive a certificate of attendance sometime in the next week. We'll also be sending around a survey after the webinar is complete, and we'd love to get your feedback to help make these as great as they can be. And if you haven't already, I highly encourage you to sign up for the other webinars in this series. They can be found at, wait for it, ksjhandbook.org. See a pattern here? All right. So now it's time to introduce today's panelists. All 3 are tremendous science journalists whose work you've undoubtedly come across online, on radio and print and elsewhere. And I'm really grateful that they have agreed to participate, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. So let me introduce them for you, and then we'll get rolling. So first up will be Fen Montaigne. Fen began his journalism career at the Huma Courier, which is a small daily in Louisiana's Cajun country. He went on to spend 20 years as a newspaper editor, and 15 of them at the Philadelphia Inquirer. He was the Moscow correspondent during the collapse of the Soviet Union and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in feature writing. He spent a dozen years working as a freelance writer with articles appearing in publications you've heard of, National Geographic, The New Yorker, Wall Street Journal, among others. And is the author of several books, including a travel adventure tale called Reeling in Russia, and an account of climate change in Antarctica titled Fraser's Penguins, for which he received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He helped launch the magazine Yale Environment 360 in 2008 and is its senior editor. And Fen wrote our handbook's chapter on climate. He's going to give a high-level overview about what it means to cover climate and the environment and provide some tips on doing so. After Fen, we're going to hear from Neela Banerjee. Neela is NPR's first ever supervising climate editor, tasked with working across the newsroom to lead the network's broad climate coverage. And for those of you who may be not familiar with NPR, if you're in other parts of the world, it's a national public radio network here in the US. Before starting at NPR in April 2020, so her entire tenure has been during COVID, Neela spent 5 years as a senior correspondent at Inside Climate News, where she led the team that revealed how Exxon had actually been conducting its own ambitious climate research as far back as the mid-1970s. Just imagine how the world could have been different. The Exxon project spurred public interest in the Exxon project spurred public interest lawsuits, won more than a dozen national journalism awards, and was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for public service reporting. Before Inside Climate News, Neela was the energy and environment reporter at the New York Times in their Washington bureau. And before that was a reporter for the New York Times and had beats as diverse as global energy, the Iraq War, and faith in America, which I presume is about religion rather than whether our country will continue to exist. Sorry, there's some jets flying overhead. She began her journalism career at the Wall Street Journal. My apologies if I'm getting drowned out by all right, hopefully that is going past here. As I was saying, Neela began her journalism career at the Wall Street Journal, where she served mostly as a Russia correspondent. She grew up all over the US, but mostly in Southeast Louisiana, and is a graduate of Yale University. She will focus her talk primarily on the accountability aspect of covering climate. And then our third panelist is Lindsay Gilbert, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Southerly. She was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky, and is now based in Durham, North Carolina. She's a reporter and editor who has covered climate change, energy, environmental justice all over the US, and is currently a John S. Knight Community Impact Fellow at Stanford University. Her work has appeared in Harper's, High Country News, The Washington Post, Hakai, The Atlantic, Grist, Outside, and many more. Lindsay's talk is going to focus primarily on accessibility and on reaching audiences on this topic without turning them off. All right, so enough for me. You're not here for me, you're here for them. So I'm going to turn it over to Fen in just a moment. I again want to encourage you to make ample use of the chat and the Q&A features. And Fen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me get my technical issues sorted here. Hold on one sec. Is that slide coming up, Josh?
Not yet.
Okay, hold on.
There we go.
Got it?
Yep, we're there.
Excellent. All right, well, let me, hold on one sec, folks. Great. Well, listen, Josh, thank you very much. Thank you, Saad, for working out all these details. And thank you very much, Neela and Lindsay, who spoke to me at length for this chapter and offered some really helpful insights that they're going to talk about shortly. So I'm going to give you an overview of what our chapter covers, but more broadly, an overview of just some of my thoughts and thoughts that I've plagiarized from my colleagues about the climate and environment story today. And in essence, this story boils down to three supremely huge and difficult and challenging problems. It's climate change, it's population growth, and it's the loss of wildlands and biodiversity. And of course, these are all interconnected. They're unprecedented in human history, the rapidity of these changes, and tackling them involves basically redoing the world's economic system, which is needless to say, a big challenge. The big story today in climate, it's quite simple. The science and the physics are not complicated. We are now putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere at levels that have not been seen for millions of years, and since the eras when volcanoes erupted and erupted for years and years and filled the air with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. We're seeing these tremendous amounts of CO2, 35 billion tons a year going into the atmosphere, lasting there for dozens, hundreds of years. And just in my professional lifetime, forget my own lifetime, I was born in 1952. From my professional lifetime in the 1970s, the climate has changed profoundly. Indeed, climate change only really heated up, if you will, over the last 40 plus years. That's when it's really, really gotten bad, as economies like the US, which are very hoggish, as you know, and Europe, which is less hoggish, kept spewing huge volumes of greenhouse gases at the same time as developing economies, whose citizens, of course, wanted a good standard of living, were their economies were booming. So what we've got is just this out of control CO2. The physical effects are so profound already, particularly in the world's ice zones like the Arctic, but in the Antarctic, where I spent 5 months. And one of the most obvious ones is the extent of Arctic sea ice. Here you see sea ice in the summer, last September 2020, when sea ice in the Arctic is at its minimum extent. The extent of sea ice covering the Arctic Ocean is about half of what it was since satellite measurements began in 1979. The volume, meaning the thickness, has experienced even a greater decline. And you're already seeing sea levels, even though now only going up in increments measured in millimeters, sea level is starting to rapidly increase. And by the end of the century, the conservative estimate is 3 feet of sea level rise around the world. Many people think it could go to 6. And a key thing as you're editing and writing about stories with climate change is the pace of change is much faster, much worse, if you will, than scientists have been projecting. It's worse than we thought it was going to be. Then there's this reality, particularly, God forbid, in my beloved United States, where people are still driving massive pickups and SUVs. This is the what can I say about this thing? It's a Ford X50 pickup. The Ford F-150 is the largest selling vehicle in America. The top 3 selling vehicles in the United States are these massive, overpowered, gas-guzzling pickups. So basically, to varying degrees, the Europeans tend to be much better than we are. The world is going about its business like nothing's happening almost. And frankly, on the climate front, even though renewables are growing rapidly, et cetera, we are not making a dent in emissions. If you look at this chart, going back 800,000 years as measured in gas concentrations and ice cores, you can see that CO2 has bounced around over almost 1 million years between a little below 200 parts per million to about 300. And now we are in this astonishing increase. We have hit 417 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. That is incredible. In the 1950s, when I was born, it was around 300. We're now at 417. When we launched Yale Environment 360 in 2008, where were we in 2008? We were probably at about 370. And the CO2 is just soaring. In fact, a few weeks ago, Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, speaking at President Biden's climate summit, pointed out that the data of what's happening in the world just does not match the rhetoric of all these pledges, et cetera. And the gap is getting bigger. So that, in a nutshell, is the climate story now. A lot of talk. We're getting some solar, we're getting some wind, but the pace of reducing emissions is woefully inadequate. So a few basics about that with the help of people like Neela and Lindsay, I put together on covering climate. Let me check my clock. The science is settled. The greenhouse effect is as certain as when you drop an apple falls from the tree, it goes down, it doesn't go up. Science is settled. Forget about the climate change skeptics unless, and this was pointed out to me by Justin Gillis, the former New York Times climate reporter, unless you're writing about politics and public opinion, especially in the US. And Australia is also a notable exception with so many deniers, because in the US, this group of flat earthers, these people who don't believe in science in the US Congress, is influential. And at the state level, they're influential. And they have been a great impediment to progress on this issue. Neil is going to talk about this. The climate change story is absolutely everywhere now. Environmental and social justice, health, economics, etc. It is permeating everything because the changes are coming so rapidly. But here's the twist. They're coming rapidly, and you can already see changes in many ecosystems. But in temperate zones, if you lived in the Arctic, you lived in Alaska, you lived in Greenland, your mind would be blown by the changes. But down here in the lower 48, they're bad, but it's not severely affecting people yet. Although in cases like the droughts and fires in Western US, I just take back that last statement. Of course it is. So I've already mentioned this huge gap. Oh, and even though global warming is a global phenomenon, as journalists, the best way to break it down is to cover the local impacts, which are becoming more pronounced. And finally, you want to give readers the news straight, but frankly, right now the news is so bad that it helps to look at some of the solutions. And there's some promising solutions, but they're just not yet on a scale that's making any difference. We are not reducing emissions. We're moving in the opposite direction. So the climate story is clear. Here, the last, since 2005, the 10 hottest years on record have been recorded, okay? So you have that right there. But the story is complex. And you're talking about big changes in the atmospheric and oceanic currents of the globe. So for example, here is an example of deforestation in the Amazon. We don't know what the impact of this is going to be yet. We know it's not going to be good. We know the Amazon's going to get drier. We're not quite sure when the Amazon is going to go from being an absorber or sink of carbon dioxide to becoming a source. And we may not be that far away. And we don't know if the Amazon's going to hit a tipping point where it could become a huge source of CO2 rather than what it is now, which is basically one of the lungs of the earth. This is Hurricane Umberto in 2019. We do know that storms are going to get more severe, have already gotten more severe. We do know that oceans are warming and that creates bigger hurricanes, but we're still not sure how all that is going to play out. However, the attribution of extreme weather events to climate change with every passing year and decade is becoming clearer, the role that climate change is playing. Let me just one sec here. So for reporters, it's very important to cover the complexity of this story and put the changes you're writing about in the context of these larger term, long-term changes. Be very careful not to overhype the latest developments because the story, as I've said, is bad enough as it is. So if you overhype things or hype things, it's just going to confuse people. And if you have to issue a correction or retraction, or say, well, anyway, it's bad enough. So, don't go overboard and stay on top of the latest science and talk to scientists. It's complicated, but it's doable. And a lot of government agencies like NOAA and NASA do a terrific job of disseminating information. So hold on now. Why are my slides not moving? Hold on one sec. Hold on. Sorry about this. Saad, any ideas? Oh, there we are. Sorry. Okay, Neil is going to get into this, but it's key to hold politicians, business people accountable for their obfuscation and prevarication. And Neil is going to talk about how Inside Climate did that with Exxon, how they did it with the American Farm Bureau. And again, this is another good way of covering obstructionist politicians, is to point out how what they're doing, like with the American Farm Bureau, is adversely impacting their own constituents. And in terms of deniers, I can't quite see this quote because I've got all these pictures in front of it, but just as Justin Gillis said, a third of the US Congress is climate deniers, and a bunch of them going around spouting complete nonsense, like James Inhofe, the senator from Oklahoma, who, when it snowed in Washington, pointed to that as proof that climate change wasn't real. So it's helpful to hold these folks to account as well. And also, again, hold politicians on a local level who are opposing climate measures to account as their constituents' houses burn, as their fields dry, etc. And why, in a place like Dauphin Island, Alabama, is US and state taxpayer money being used to rebuild this island of fancy homes time and again with hurricanes? We've looked into this. It needs to be, you need to keep looking into it. Why are politicians and developers putting tens of billions of dollars in new real estate developments in Florida? Well, where if we go up in the next century to 2 or 3 degrees increase in temperature, a third of the state's going to be underwater. So, these are the kind of issues that are important to cover. And cover, again, the local impacts. We are looking in the US West this summer at what could be one of the worst droughts, certainly since 2012 and even before then. The fire season, which was terrible last year, I was in Oregon during a good part of it. It was awful, looks to be awful again. So again, cover these local stories, and every region's got a story. The Gulf of Maine has warmed by 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit with knock-on effects on lobsters, fisheries, etc. So covering the broader environmental story, very similar issues, and I'm going to rip through these last 2 slides, but put them in the context of wider social and economic issues. Don't let the fossil fuel industry off the hook. They are going nowhere, and they have a lot of influence. They, for the most part, despite their talk, are obstructing efforts to decarbonize. And and Lindsay will talk about this, as the reach of traditional newspapers rapidly wanes, collaborations are super important. Some red flags when you're assigning a story. What's new here? This subject, climate environment, is covered to the nth degree. So find out what's new. Don't do the same stories again and again and again, like the Ile de Jean Charles area in Cajun country where I once worked, going underwater. That story has been covered hundreds of times. Get in your local area, cover a climate story there. Beware of advocacy masquerading as reporting. Don't overhype new technology and new developments. Beware of stories, Lindsay will discuss this, that perpetuate stereotypes about communities. Finally, as a way out, it's very important to put pressure on and cover the government, where policies with a carbon tax, with research and development, are absolutely vital to get us out of this mess. But it's also super important to cover the private sector. There's a political scientist named Roger Pielke, fairly conservative. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but he has something called the iron law of climate politics, policy and economics, and that's very simple. The only way large-scale decarbonization measures are going to be adopted is if it does not cause too much pain to people's lives and lifestyles. People are not going to sacrifice their automobile. They're obviously heating their home. So the private sector in developing these technologies is absolutely vital. And finally, try not to throw up your hands. David Wallace Wells wrote an excellent book called The Uninhabitable Earth, basically saying it's going to be a hellscape in a century. He might be right, but there are plenty of smart people, including a report issued by the IEA this week, that are working on this. And you got to keep hope and keep the faith, because it is right now a pretty grim story. Thanks.
Hey, thanks, Ben. That was terrific. There's a couple of questions. One I want to post to you now, which is somebody asked, everybody's suddenly talking about climate. How can reporters do a better job of breaking through the noise? Your thoughts on that?
That is a very tough question. I think one way is, again, to drill down on the local level, what's happening in your community, to the farmers, to the fishermen. I also think that coming at these stories in a fair and straight manner as possible, we're all biased, is very important. And because, as I think Lindsay will talk about this, there's not a lot of sense preaching to the choir. You want to do stories that listen to the voices of people who are not being heard, who may have doubts about, are humans causing climate change? And I think it's very important to get out and talk to these people as well, and talk about their concerns, particularly as it concerns their communities.
Terrific. And then Sharmila asked, and I think this actually is a nice segue to Neela, is it useful to cover the actions of local government? And that feels like that might be a segue into Neela. So
totally,
right?
Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
Absolutely.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
1000%, yes. So I am not as adept with my slides. So I think Saad is going to have to put them up, and we'll go through my slides with him. So anyway, there we go. So yeah, so thank you very much, everyone. Hello. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I know that in our audience, we have reporters and editors. For nearly all of my career, I was a reporter, and now I've spent the last year as an editor, as Josh explained. So my position at NPR is newly created. It didn't exist before they hired me. And that's because historically, climate change has been covered by the NPR science desk. And NPR now fully recognizes that climate change is not just a science story. Science underpins our work as climate journalists, for sure. Have the next slide, please. But climate change is an economic story. It's a political one. It affects business, public health, national security, racial justice. So my job is to work with different reporters across NPR to help them with their climate stories. So it could be somebody who covers agriculture in the US, for example, or a reporter based in Beirut who did a story about how climate change threatens the country's, ancient, iconic cedar trees that you see on their flag. So the fact that climate change touches just about everything is exciting, but I can also see how it could feel overwhelming too, especially if you haven't been covering climate that long, or if you cover other things and climate is one of the issues that you're covering. So how do you as a journalist choose what to cover and what to focus on? The first step, of course, is to discuss your priorities with your colleagues, with your reporters, if you're an editor, with your team, and then talk to outside experts, from scientists to government officials to doctors, and obviously listen to the regular people in your community about what's happening to their lives, their property, their ability to work. If you take all of this and you focus even more, the most interesting thing for me, the most interesting questions about climate change have to do with accountability. So what does accountability mean? For me, broadly speaking, it's the gap between what scientists and independent experts recommend we do to reduce emissions or adapt to climate change, and what politicians, government agencies, and corporations are actually doing. The US response to climate change as a society is among the clearest examples of that gap. So in the US, we have known for more than 30 years that climate change is driven largely by human activity. Over those decades, we've learned more about what we need to do about climate change, and that is that we must cut emissions because the US has until now contributed the greatest amount of greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere. And then we must adapt to climate fuel changes so that people, not polar bears or anything else, but people don't get hurt, right? As much as I like polar bears, climate change is really about people. But the US is the birthplace of climate denial, and it's flourished most aggressively here. Next slide, please. There's an entire political party, which includes millions and millions of Americans who don't think climate change is real. They think scientists are overreacting. These people have called climate change a hoax. And those people who say all of this include the last American president. So because of the prevalence of climate denial in the US, we failed so far to adequately address climate change. So accountability or investigative climate journalism asks, what does the failure to address climate change look like? Why don't the powerful do enough on climate to help us, the regular people, to adapt to the threats of extreme weather? And to be clear, I'm referring to politicians of any party, to all sorts of corporations, and to government agencies at any and every level. So that goes to the question that was in the Q&A. Yes, local officials, state officials, everybody, they deserve your scrutiny. And you know, kind of very broadly speaking, what you're doing is that you're looking at the status quo on climate and you're asking questions about it. Next slide, please. So I wanted to go through a few examples of climate accountability work with you that I hope give you a sense of the questions and methods that have guided my colleagues and me on these projects. Before I worked at NPR, as Joshua said, I was the senior investigative reporter at Inside Climate News, which is a US-based, small, nonprofit media outlet. It's quite young, it's about 13 years old, and it's digital only, and it's free. So I led a team of reporters whose work ultimately led to that hashtag ExxonKnew. Next slide, please. More importantly, our work yielded important revelations about Exxon and the broader oil and gas industry. And as a result of our investigation, several states and cities have sued oil companies for the role they played in fueling climate change, and those lawsuits are outgoing. So then the question is, what did Exxon know, and why does that even matter? So when we did the project, many people who follow climate change politics in the US and abroad, they already had heard that Exxon was a leading architect of the climate denial narrative, a narrative that basically focused on doubt about the science and overstated the potential costs of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. Our investigation at Inside Climate showed something new. So, we knew that Exxon was this architect of doubt, but our investigation showed that almost 15 years before Exxon led the effort to deny climate change and delay action on it, it conducted its own ambitious in-house climate research program. And we proved this because we've managed to obtain a whole bunch of internal documents dating back to the mid-1970s. And that was a big discovery, that Exxon was doing honest, rigorous climate research as early as the late 1970s because it accepted that climate change driven by fossil fuel use is real. It accepted the science that it would ultimately work to deny. So that project, and I'm kind of telling you about this so that you can understand like how the project started and maybe apply it to things that you're thinking about doing as journalists. So that project started with a question, and it did not actually focus on Exxon. The question that we started with at Inside Climate was, what did large fossil fuel companies know about climate change, and when did they know it? Now, I know that that question sounds far too broad. We thought so at the time too, but after some internal discussion, we decided to pursue the reporting. And when a question is this broad, you need to cast your net broadly. That's what we did. We read studies, we talked to a wide range of scientists, to former employees of all sorts of fossil fuel companies. We kept asking, what did your company know, and when did they know it about climate change? One of those scientists told us about Exxon, and that Exxon was doing serious research on climate change as far back as the 1980s. So that made us sit up and take notice, because until then, research that companies were doing into climate was in the 1990s. So the clock went back a whole decade. We focused on Exxon, we began digging, and that led to the documents we found, and the stories we published. And then from our stories, it inspired journalists around the world to do their own stories, looking at Shell, looking at BP, looking at the auto industry in the United States. And all of those articles taken together have changed our understanding of the responsibility that fossil fuel companies bear for climate change and bear for stopping action on climate change. So the lesson there is when you're doing accountability stories, it's okay to be ambitious, at least from time to time. And it might feel crazy when you're asking such big questions. And your investigation might not always lead to that big blockbuster story, but it could very well yield very good stories. Not every story has to be this, enormous thing. And you'll have your story that's like the top story that you want to get, but then you'll have a story that's a very good story, and those are worthy of doing. So the people who know the questions to ask about what's happening with climate change are your editors. So encourage them to look at their beats, their areas of expertise, and question the status quo. So for example, Fen was talking about construction happening in Florida or in Alabama. Many of you might live in areas where there's a big flood risk, either inland flooding or high tide flooding or hurricanes. And in your communities, allow developers to keep building there. And so that, so you don't have to be a climate reporter. You could be a local business reporter or a neighborhood reporter or a real estate reporter. And climate should inform the questions you're asking about that status quo, right? Why does this keep happening when we know these buildings will flood? So it's those reporters who have an understanding of the beat, can see changes over time, that can come up with great ideas. And that's what happened when we did a project at Inside Climate that looked at American agriculture. Next slide, please. So my colleague at Inside Climate, Georgina Gustin, had covered agriculture for many years, and she saw a contradiction that puzzled us. So American farmers are badly affected by the extreme weather fueled by climate change. And they can also reduce emissions by changing some of their farming practices, and they can earn money while doing this too. Yet American farmers and their industry lobby denied climate change for decades and actively worked against measures to cut emissions. No politicians dared to rein them in. People were even afraid to take them on, but more afraid of them than they were of fossil fuel companies. So during a 6-month investigation, we found that American farming learned as early as the 1980s about climate change. And they didn't want to do anything because they were deeply reliant on fossil fuels for their business, to run machinery, to power buildings, and provide raw materials for fertilizer and pesticides. They're also very politically conservative historically, and they're allied with big business. And they are a big business. So as a result, the farm lobby worked hand in glove with the fossil fuel industry to delay and defeat action on climate change. Next slide, please. And here with this project, the beat reporter Georgina and I looked at what everybody in Washington saw and knew and asked why. Why is it that no one tries to regulate American farming? And why does the biggest, most powerful farm lobby work against the interests of American farmers when it comes to climate change? As investigative journalists will often tell you, not just in climate, but anywhere, the story, some of the best stories are just lying in plain sight. It's just most of us just don't see the importance of them anymore because we've gotten so used to it. And the last example I want to give has to do with something we did here at NPR. So last year when I began at NPR, 2 climate reporters who covered different kinds of catastrophes driven by climate change realized that they were hearing the same thing from survivors of these catastrophes in different parts of the country. So Rebecca Hersher is based in NPR's Washington headquarters, and she often covered the aftermath of hurricanes and flooding. Lauren Summer is based in California, and she frequently covered wildfires, which are a natural part of life in the American West. Next slide, please. In the aftermath of the disasters they covered, each reporter often heard from survivors that they had no idea that they lived in a flood zone or a wildfire zone. So why didn't people know? That's what the reporters were asking. Like over and over again, they heard the same lament, and they asked, like, why didn't these people know? So as it turns out, when you look for a home to rent or buy in the US, you get lots of information. You find out the quality of nearby schools, where the supermarkets are, the condition of your roof. So how could it be that people got no information about the risk of events that could harm them physically, emotionally, and financially? Next slide, please. So the reporters began to to ask why millions of Americans who move each year knew so little about climate risk to their homes. What they discovered was, to put it bluntly, failure, right? The failure of everyone involved in the real estate chain to tell people about wildfire or flood risk, and the failure of the federal, state, and local governments to mandate that prospective home buyers and renters get clear, timely information. Next slide, please. In this case, the reporters decided that it was not enough to tell people what was wrong. And this kind of goes to what Fen was talking about regarding solutions. They knew that they could reveal what was wrong, but that real estate companies and the government weren't going to do anything to fix the situation soon. So our NPR reporters set about educating the audience about questions to ask about flood and wildfire risk when they do go house hunting. And they also let our audience know what kind of information they could expect to get. A lot of it was not going to be terribly complete. So they even came up with a one-page document that people could print out and take with them when they looked at real estate that had 6 key questions about wildfire and 6 key questions about flood risk. Next slide, please. The 3 examples I've shared with you show how far we can go as journalists in covering climate change and how deep. The projects delved into business, agriculture, real estate, and politics. They empowered people with information when our own governments and our local businesses refuse to give people that information. So what I want to say in closing is I urge you as journalists to keep asking questions of the powerful people and institutions in your communities that are responsible for cutting emissions and keeping us safe from climate change. That's the only way that our audiences will know the risks they face, and if those risks are being taken seriously by those who have the money and the power. One last thing is I realize that in many places, these kinds of investigations are tricky, if not outright dangerous. And maybe during the Q&A portion, we can discuss ways to protect yourself when you do investigative work. That's all for me. Thanks for your attention.
Hey, thanks, Neela. We've got a lot of questions, and I want to just pose one to you now. We'll come back to more of them after Lindsay has a chance to talk. But there's a question here about balancing investigating, corporations and government's responsibility, as many of them lead, strategies that can address climate change, and yet, so often much of the onus on climate change is placed on the individual and the individual responsibilities, and don't get plastic bags or don't do this at the grocery store. So I wonder, the question here is asking, how do you balance that? How do you handle that?
So I think in 2 ways. I think a lot of people are interested in what they can do as individuals because they care. They care about the climate. They care about the environment. They want to be better citizens of their communities and planets, and planet rather, since there's only one of their communities and planet. And I think it's useful and kind of empowering to say, look, if you, for example, Americans waste a lot of food. So if you want to reduce emissions from that, maybe you can compost, you can pay to have your stuff composted by community organizations, or you can even set up community composting. I understand why people want to do that. The peril, though, the danger of that is that corporations, government want to shift responsibility for cutting emissions to us as individuals rather than what can be done on a massive global scale. It's the same thing. A paper just came out recently that showed that's the same tactic that the tobacco industry used in making sure that we didn't smoke. Well, it's an individual choice. Well, I can't go out and build an electric car, right? I can only buy the cars that companies manufacture. And if there is an impetus from the market or from government to reduce emissions and therefore stimulate the production of electric cars, then I can buy an electric car. But my choices are shaped by the government and by corporations, right? So be careful about that. Don't go down that path and think like it's all on us as regular people and we need to do this. Ultimately, the biggest way that it's on you as a regular person is in educating yourself about this stuff and on voting for people, regardless of their party, who accept climate change and who are willing to do something about it. So it's that kind of stuff that doesn't really end up in those stories about, individual versus what governments do. It's, people try to make it a lifestyle issue, and lifestyle does matter, but only to a certain point. Really, to make those massive changes, it has to be on a government and corporate level.
Thanks. Yeah, that reminds me, there's I've seen some stories about how the chemical industry in particular has tried to shift the burden of recycling from them to individuals, and it's been a
Not
very
only
effective way.
not only that, but really like there's a great documentary that's on our public broadcasting station in the US, so TV, called there's a investigative documentary series called Frontline. And one of the NPR reporters on the investigative team, Laura Sullivan, I'm just giving you these names so you can look it up, you can Google this, did a terrific hour-long documentary about a year ago about what a scam recycling really is, that it's a way to extend the life of fossil fuels so that even if, as we use less, say, to put in our gas tanks, that it can be something that fossil fuels can be used for plastics and for chemicals. And a lot of stuff, just can't be, you think it can be recycled, you feel virtuous and you feel like you're helping if you're put something in the recycling bin, but at the end of the day, it can't be recycled. So that is very much worth watching, and that it's not just on us, but it's the way the system has been created to make you think that this is a solution when it really isn't.
Terrific. There's a lot of questions. I promise we'll get to as many of them as we can, but first I want to turn it over to Lindsay and have her take her time here.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you all for coming, and I'm learning a lot too on this end, so it's awesome to be here. I will share my slides real quick. All right. There it goes. All right, so I'm going to talk kind of the extension of what Neela was starting to get into about how we if we're looking at climate as something that intersects with everything else in our lives, how do we communicate that in a way that makes sense for people, especially because this issue has been politicized for so long. So just as a quick reminder, I run a magazine called Southerly that's mostly digital. We cover this part of the United States, the Southeast, and we partner with local newsrooms to help them do environmental reporting and also work on projects with those partners to make sure that information actually gets out to people that need to read it, particularly the populations that are most at risk of pollution, of other environmental injustices, of climate change effects. So Black, Indigenous, and people of color, Latinx populations, poor people, rural people, all of that. So that's our main focus. And we cover climate a lot. I started Southerly because I saw a huge gap in reporting on it at a regional and local level. And really wanted to show how to make it more accessible and useful for people when they're worrying about the place that they live, their home, their family, their bank accounts, their farms, things that are in their immediate vicinity and that they can see. So these are sort of the things that I was coming up with this presentation. What really makes me a climate story, besides all of the things that Fen and Neela have talked about. A climate story is about power and equity and justice and race and class and gender and healthcare. As Neela said, it intersects with all of those topics and beats, as you call them, right? But it's more about that in any particular story. We have to give context to what else is at play, what other systems are at play that cause a certain population to be affected by a storm, or a certain housing system to fail during some storm, or why a certain pollution event happened. We have to talk about race and class in all of those ways, and so we focus that on a lot of that here at Southerly. Also, it's incredibly complicated, it's because humans are complicated and we don't make a lot of sense a lot of the time. And it's also just climate change is abstract, and it's hard to, especially when it has been politicized for so long, as we've, come to find out, it really makes it difficult for people to see, why should I care when I'm just trying to put food on the table, right? And that means local reporting and place-based reporting in particular is really important, I think, to show what's happening, because people may not really care about a story about, you know, the international climate meeting in wherever, but they would care to talk about how, you know, pieces of that affect where they're right now, what's happening to the place that they live. Also, we've talked a little bit about solutions in all of these presentations, and I think that's important. And it's also important to note that, you know, these stories are about community-driven solutions. They historically, you know, journalism has been incredibly extractive in, you know, going in trying to kind of like have a narrative already played out in place about a particular community or location, and not realize that people are experts of their own lives. Like they might not be willing to talk about climate change, right, or environmental policy, but they or not understand, you know, all the nuances of that, but they do know that their backyard is changing or their farm is changing, and are often really willing to talk about it in those terms. And they also have ideas for what they should do to fix it, because they know the place that they live. And so I think more listening on that front can lead to better stories that are really serving the population that, you know, you're trying to reach. And again, it's just about making people feel included and heard and seen, because I think especially with environmental and climate journalism for so long, that just hasn't been the case because it hasn't been covered enough. And we just have to do extra work, I think, in this field to show, like, this is, in our own newsrooms, this is valuable, and also to our audience that this is not a siloed thing, like this is affecting your lives. So I just want to show a few different kind of versions of stories that we've been doing lately, just that range from everything from how Indigenous communities are handling, you know, the intersection of sort of like climate change and the pandemic, to kind of Q&As with leaders, kind of grassroots leaders on the ground. You know, how policy, sort of the ones in the right corner, how policies are affecting specific places. So it's, again, it's not, this is happening, but like, this is why it matters for your county or your town. And then also, of course, like in big energy infrastructure projects, things like that. At sea level rise, obviously, that's a very big one. We've been covering a lot of about the hurricane season in the last year in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which was hit by 2 hurricanes last year, then a winter storm in February, and then flooded like 2 days ago. And then hurricane season starts in June, the Atlantic hurricane season. So it's a lot. And we're trying to kind of dig into particular places. Again, this, you know, it touches, this story really is about everyone and everything. You know, sometimes I feel like we tell climate stories about, you know, power plants and coal ash, which are the bottom 2 photos, about sea level rise, about protests and communities that are being displaced. But you know, often maybe those, you know, we mention climate change in it, but it's not in the headline necessarily. It's just sort of always in the background, because we know that it's always related to what we need to do to make sure that things don't get worse, right? And then the other thing I just wanted to mention was, you know, really important is centering community in these stories. So meeting people where they're at, and Inside Climate News, Middle Ground, was that what it was called, Neela? Finding Middle Ground? Yeah. Yeah, that was a great series, like as an example to look up, that was done by a national outlet, but really looked at how people were coming to terms with the sort of like divisiveness of climate change in their communities. And I think that is incredibly important. Like I often say on every panel I'm on that I don't really care who believes in climate change anymore if they're not like someone in power. Like the normal people who are picking up the newspaper and reading it, like, it does not matter to me if they believe in it. They might say that, but they know that their community is flooding, or their farm is dried up, or they're in danger of a wildfire. And like, they want to talk about those things. And even if that connection isn't necessarily made at first, that's our job, right? Is to make that connection and show that. And that takes time and effort and energy and consistent coverage. Providing basic information that's lacking or inadequate at the government level, i.e. the NPR a project to show people what, like if they were in a flood zone or what to ask. Like that sort of public service journalism is so important because there are a declining number of news outlets in the US, specifically ones that are covering Black and other communities of color. And also, there's a lot of disinformation out there by fossil fuel companies, by chemical companies, by politicians who are bought by them to, they write the op-eds in these papers, they put out flyers, like they're giving out the information. So we have to really meet people where they are and look and see what they're getting and what they need to know so that they can make more informed decisions. And always asking, who this story is serving. I think historically, like a lot of climate journalism has really been just preaching to the choir, and we're just sort of starting to get to the point where it's bringing in more people talking about environmental justice, making sure like underserved communities are prioritized, that sort of thing. And so it's moving in the right direction, but it's, there's a lot of harm that has been done trust-wise, and so in journalism in general, and also around this topic. So, working on that and having that in mind in our stories, I think is really important. Just a quick examples. The sort of I was talking about with meeting people where they're at and like what they need basic information. We've been doing several different projects, like resource guides that we print out or share on social media about like things that people, like a lot of times people will just say, I don't know how to contact like FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the US, if they needed money after, their house was, or their house or place that they're renting was destroyed or damaged by a hurricane. Like just that basic information. And we're sort of, I think sometimes in journalism, we think very high level, like, okay, let's do this huge investigation and 6-part series and we'll, win a Pulitzer Prize for it. And in reality, like what matters is that someone knows what to do if they need to evacuate next time there's a storm, and so they might not have time to, in their day-to-day lives to read something like that, but would really appreciate sort of the basic information that they're not getting access to or that is misrepresented to them. And so I think kind of balancing that in our coverage in these topic areas, looking at what do people say they need to know, what question, like specific questions are they trying to get answered, and then how can we tell beautiful stories with that, right, informative stories with that. And so I think that has helped me in the last year or so. And also partnerships. Those are my dogs. I just thought I'd put them on the screen. So bringing context, we do a lot of partnerships with local news outlets because we know how climate change and environmental issues are affecting the South as a whole, and how those are related, and how politicians are, riffing off of each other to have these ridiculous laws to stop the lawsuits against oil companies or things about, not mentioning climate change in specific documents, things like that. We can kind of tie those all together, but our local partners, public radio stations, newspapers, really have the expertise on the ground, and they know people and are building trust. And we can also share resources. I mean, I think all of us sort of on this call probably know that a lot of our newsrooms are strapped, and especially when it comes to this coverage is usually kicked down the road. I think in terms of priorities in a lot of newsrooms. And so resource sharing and working together, if you are in a particular community, area, geographic region, we've done an international partnership before, comparing solutions in Nigeria to diseases transmitted by kind of issues with sewage infrastructure to what's happening in rural Alabama. So there's just a lot of connections to be drawn, and I think that helps people understand climate change better and how what they're doing at the local level is really having an impact at the national level, or vice versa. And so I highly recommend that, and I'm happy to talk more about that later. And there's my email. I'll throw it in the chat too. But yeah, thank you all for listening, and I'm excited to talk more about this in the Q&A.
Thanks, Lindsay. That's terrific. And we do have a lot of questions and comments, which I'll try and sort through as many as I can here in our last half hour or so. Before I get to those, and I'm also going to try, we'll see how this works. I can click a button here to let people ask their question live. So I'll sort of call you out and see if that works and give a little experiment. But I wanted to ask y'all sort of two quick questions. One is, there was a story I came across not too long ago, and this was completely new to me, that about every 10 or 20 years, I forget the exact amount, the National Weather Service resets what normal temperatures are. And so, and I think that's happening now, or it's just happened. And so, for example, if on May 20th, I live in the Washington, D.C. area, if a normal high temperature is 72 degrees, but over the last 20 years, that's crept up, now the norm will be 74 degrees or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, as reporters, what do you think about that? Because it seems to me that that is, although this is figurative, it is almost literally shifting the goalposts and can really reframe how people think about what normal is and what that means for climate change. I wonder if any of you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we did. So my colleague Jennifer Ludden at NPR, who covered energy environment for a while, she did a story about this. So there's a, for those of you who don't live in the States, there's this federal agency that gathers information about weather, and they do update it. I think it is every 10 years, and they look at 30-year periods. So 30-year period was shifted, to, I think it's like 1980 to 2010. I think that's the new period. The point is that, as Josh said, that period is hotter, as like we saw and so do people, there's a danger in thinking that what's is actually abnormal, and it's abnormal because it's driven by climate change, is now normal, and so, but in our coverage and in the New York Times story that was done a few days ago, those perils were discussed, right? That this is, you do have to have more up-to-date frames of reference and data, but it does make people feel like they're getting used to, like somebody just said in the comments, that the baseline has been shifted. And so, like, if you have 50 days over 105 degrees in Phoenix, Arizona, in the Southwest United States, that's not really that abnormal, when in fact, we know that it's largely driven by climate change. So it is complicated, but that is definitely happening, and we're all definitely working on it and trying to put it in that context.
Fen, I think you're muted.
You're still muted.
Unmute.
There you go.
Now good? Okay.
Yep.
On a related issue, I think a really effective way to present the dramatic changes that have happened in the climate in the last 4+ decades, and a wonderful visual and graphic potential, is to show, not just show how rapidly things are changing. And there's a website in the US called Climate Central that does fabulous depictions of how things have changed in terms of temperature increases, how extreme weather has gotten more common, and then they project forward based on anticipated sea level rise and the knowledge of good scientists at what's going to be flooded in 40, 50, 80 years. And I think when people see what has changed and what's coming, that is a very effective tool of driving home the message. And then maybe you might change some behaviors.
Very good. I have one other quick thing before I turn it over to the comments. It seems to me that one of the biggest climate stories in years dropped yesterday. And that is that Ford released or announced its F-150 electric car or electric truck. And I say this because, at least in the US, and I think this is probably somewhat true around the world, it is the best-selling vehicle for like the last 45 years. And that is to say, more F-150s are bought than any other car or truck. So I guess my question is, I've been looking at reviews of this vehicle, and sometimes they talk about how important electrification is to solving climate. Sometimes it's not mentioned at all. And I guess I wonder, from your point of view, do you think that, everything from consumer reviews of consumer products should bring climate into, should bring it up, or should it set it aside because it ends up being a turnoff and just focus on, this is a a fun truck to drive and whatever other benefits it has.
Mila, do you want to take that?
Yeah.
Thoughts,
God,
but-
this is, it's like, my work schedule and the people we're discussing at Insight Climate, at the NPR, but it doesn't have to be. So with the F-150, clearly, Ford sees a market. They also see a federal imperative to reduce emissions, and so they're responding to those things. Look, I don't think it's. It needs to be, it kind of depends on your audience, right? Like NPR listeners and readers, they care a lot about climate change. That's why my job exists. So you can spend more time talking about the impact of this on climate in the broader context of electrifying our vehicles. If you're writing for like Car and Driver, it'll probably be like a paragraph like farther into the story, and you'll focus on what a great ride it is. So it does depend on context, but I don't think it should be excluded. And I think that it depends, that people who are normally just like looking at a consumer product because it's something that they want, often want a little bit of information too about the social good from it. So yeah, it's not, it doesn't have to be front and center always, but there's no harm in putting a few sentences in it. And people, some people will complain, but so what? There's a lot of other people who might now consider getting a truck because it's electric and it's not super expensive.
Great. Go ahead, Tenor.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about this. I'm not skeptical about what you pointed out, that electrification of vehicles is vital. And I think GM has promised to electrify at least its car fleet by 2035. But here's a case where government can really play a role. And Obama and now Biden are tightening up mileage standards so you get better fuel economy. Trump, of course, undid it all. And the fact is that these US pickup trucks are totally, obscenely, unnecessarily big. And people may like that, that's fine, but there's a cost to that. And that's why I think a carbon tax is a good idea. And also this is a clear case where government regulation can help. So, Ford's going to sell 1 million F-Series trucks in 2021, probably. There might be, I don't know, a tiny fraction that's going to be electric. So I think the car companies have talked a green game, but for the most part, the US big makers have a terrible, terrible record on this.
They do have a terrible record. And the question becomes, what are the auto standards for the fleets that the Biden administration is going to come out with? This kind of goes to that question that you had, Josh, about individual choices, right? People can make individual choices, but the imperative comes from on high from government and corporations.
Great. All right, so we'll try an experiment here. David Nagai, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You have a question, and I think I've made it so you can ask it. We'll give this a shot, and if it doesn't work, I'll ask it for you, but let's try it. Is it working? All right. Maybe there's something I'm not doing correctly. So David asks, what is the connection between climate change and migration? How do I make that connection when I'm reporting about illegal migrations from Africa to Europe, for example?
There's a huge connection between climate change and migration all over the world, and including in industrialized countries like the United States. And I think that, one thing I wanted to respond to that David's question gets to, but I saw others in the chat as well, is that where do you as a journalist find those authoritative voices to explain those connections? And I think there are academics in your home countries, in your communities, in the US and other places who are looking into these issues. And then there's international things like Google Scholar, where you can find information and talk to academics who are outside your home country. But this is a really big issue. A terrific climate journalist, Abram Lustgarten, who is with ProPublica, did a series, I think it was last year, about climate change and migration. And so there's the big trends that are occurring, right? Like if there's drought or flooding or or hurricanes or wildfire that are pushing people out of their homes. And then I think the best way that you tell this, kind of what Lindsay was saying during her presentation, is that you make it very local, right? You tell the story of regular people and you and their suffering and the difficult choices that they make, and you make that part of the bigger trend. So you have the people in your communities, and the sources are largely academics. You definitely need to take it from the anecdotal and give it that broader sweep, and that comes from social science and climate science.
Okay, Andrew Park asks a question. It's directed to Fen, but I'm sure anyone can answer. Mentions, Fen, you mentioned population as one of the big three challenges. There's a subset of commenters, including some academics, with whom any mention of population as a challenge or problem triggers cries of racism or counter-arguments that population isn't actually a problem. This has caused some journalists to swear off covering population altogether. So how can you cover the real facts of population without triggering these knee-jerk reactions?
That is a very good question. I think journalists are too wary to cover population. I think a good way to do it is the way we handled it at Yale Environment 360 recently in India, where we had an Indian woman journalist do a story about what's happening in India with population. And I think clearly, as many experts have pointed out, the most important thing now is to raise standards of living, because always fertility goes down when that happens, to empower women and to educate women. That is key. In terms of the reluctance to cover it, there is a history of racism in writing about population control, and there are big issues of equity. Do you know that a child born this year, I have a granddaughter born a year ago, is going to consume, when they're an adult, or produce 20 times the greenhouse gases as one child in Bangladesh. So, you know, there are real issues of equity here, but I think it needs to be covered, particularly sub-Saharan Africa is an area where I think local writers, women writers, should write about what needs to be done to help bring down the population in countries like Nigeria, you know, in the 21st century.
Terrific. I have two questions here that I think are somewhat related that I want to direct mostly to Lindsay, although again, anyone's welcome to respond. One is from Jacob Wallace, who says, how do you cover proposed industrial development that brings economic benefits, but presents environmental challenges, especially in underserved communities? And I'm pairing that with this other question because I think they're related to, well, as you'll see, this one from Shiva Asma about explaining why caring about climate change is actually an investment in jobs and developing communities. And it feels like that gets lost in the shuffle. And Lindsay, I'm posing it to you specifically because I think that, you know, you're mentioning that many other stories about policy and decisions affect communities just in sort of uneven, unequitable ways and are directly related to climate change. And so perhaps you can address these questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think one of the things, and I notice this most in the region that I'm in, because there is so much fossil fuel production in this region, and you know, we're coming up constantly. It's pitted as economy versus environment, and it like that has been happening for decades, right? Is that, well, do you either want the jobs or do you want to listen to the environmentalists? And I'm sure that happens internationally, like constantly as well. And so I think that first, coming from a place of understanding that we have to break that down, and that is just ingrained in people, that like it's either jobs or it's protecting the environment, because that's how politicians have put it, that's how the industry has put it. And really, like I said, with the decline of local news, it's difficult to show people that you don't only have one choice. Like, it isn't this pipeline comes in through your community or you have no option for jobs. Like, it is that choice because you're the people, like, again, to Nila's accountability, like it's that way because your politicians have made it so. And so trying to connect the dots between those two things, I think is really important and useful to show people that, so I report a lot in, as an example, in North Carolina, and in Eastern North Carolina, there's a lot of solar coming in. And I've been doing quite a bit of outreach and going to community groups to try to understand like what they need information on, what's going on. Like there's a lot of hurricane related flooding, things like that, pipelines coming through, a lot of landfills and other kind of gross projects that are always proposed. And so, but there's a lot of solar. And the people that were at this meeting I was at a couple of months ago were very interested in learning more about solar, but they were coming from the perspective of, hey, these are just getting approved by our, because like the county knows that it's going to make them money, right? So the county is approving some of these solar projects, but then people are left in the dark being like, but exactly what does it do to farmland and how does it work? And like, I like this, but I don't know, like how many jobs is it going to bring in? And I think that's really where the gap is, right? Is that people are so used to things just coming through and like breezing their way through the economic development commission or whatever it may be in your particular area, and not getting any of their questions answered on like, how is that going to affect me? And that's media's role, right? And it's really hard to do if there's no journalism outlet in that space. So I think kind of connecting the dots better between sort of what exactly this particular project or thing does for people, how many, not just based on how many jobs it creates, because that's often the headline, but looking at, okay, what do people want to know about it? Like they want to know if it's a good job, if it's a well-paying job, if it's going to lead to more investment in their communities, because so often, the places that these big projects are built are in rural places that have just been like decimated in the last several decades. So I think, and also looking at sort of the combining a lot of what we've been saying for the need for economic transition. So say in Appalachia, which is coal country in the US, looking to Germany, which had to do that as well, and how they sort of changed from a coal dependent economy to really looking at tourism and renewable energy and things like that, and really what's possible and how people have the power to demand more for that. I think that really is helpful. Neela, you probably could add to this as well, I imagine.
Well, I mean, thanks for tossing it to me. I mean, because as you were talking, I was so excited because, Lindsay is on the forefront of communities, the kinds of communities that I grew up in. So I grew up in southeastern Louisiana, about 25 miles outside of New Orleans, in a parish or a county that is part of this stretch of land along the Mississippi River called Cancer Alley. And people in the United States and probably internationally have heard of it too. And it's these counties along the Mississippi between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that have become home to dozens of oil refineries and petrochemical plants. And what's so interesting to see, I mean, is that, the local people, a lot of the people who are affected are, like Lindsay was saying, they're rural communities. A lot of them are African-American, where like they put the refineries in their backyard, or because of racist racist practices, Black people couldn't buy property in other parts of their community, so they ended up next to these sites. And a lot of these people now are speaking out, and a lot of local and national media are paying attention. Lawyers are helping them. And for the first time since my family moved there, 35 years ago, it seems like a major petrochemical plant might not get built. I mean, and as Lindsay was saying, in these states that are basically extraction states, even if you're processing things, you're extracting land, water, air, human health, right? That these extraction states, the regulatory process just speeds along approval of these projects. And even though that might be happening in Louisiana because it's put as, it's held up as a place where people can get jobs, a lot of the people who might even end up working there, right? Or whose local businesses might make money from the workers who come there, are saying, it's not worth our health, right? And so there is change afoot, and it's good to see that there are other entities, media, lawyers, politicians, activists who are amplifying the voices of accountability when these sites get built.
Thank you both. That's really terrific. We got about 10 more minutes here, a little bit less than that. And I know I'm not going to get through them all, but we'll do our best. A fairly straightforward question here, I think, from Arijit Das. Again, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Where can someone get data related to climate about his or her country? Are there places like the UN that has data sets that one can get that's country specific or regional specific?
So it depends on what you want. So there are a few things. One is, and we can, once I say this stuff, I can put it in the chat. There's this thing called Carbon Tracker. It's a website that shows like whether your country is on schedule to cut its emissions, and they grade it like you would a kid in school, right? I think the United States has like a D or something like that. So it looks at countries' plans to reduce emissions. So there's stuff like that. Then there is, if there's specific issues that are emerging in a country, there's a group called the Climate Science Rapid Response Team, and it was created by American scientists, but they have scientists all over the world. And it's free, and it's a network of scientists who can answer questions for you about, like, for example, there's a typhoon that just hit, I think, Western India, and another one's on the way. So if you're a climate journalist in Mumbai and you want to see what kind of role climate change is playing in hurricane activity in that part of the Indian Ocean, then you might contact them and say, do you have any experts on hurricane activity in this part of the world? And it's not going to be instantaneous, but they could probably connect you over a day or so with somebody. And finally, the other thing, which I did for our reporter in Beirut who wanted to write about climate change and trees. I don't know anything about Lebanon and climate change. So what did I do? I went to Google Scholar, and I was just like, who's looking into climate change in Lebanon? And I found names, and I contacted those scientists, and scientists more often than not are willing to talk to you. And if you approach them humbly, as I do, because I don't know that much, about a lot of aspects of climate change, I'm just like, I don't know, can you explain it to me? They're happy to talk about their work. So those are the three big things that I would say. And my colleagues here might have other suggestions as well.
If they do, you can put them in the chat. So I'm going to try and get some more questions in. There's a couple questions here from Agan Daniel, who is asking a little bit about African perspectives, and I think is wondering if anyone here has examples of, and I think he's referring to climate change stories in Africa. I don't know if anyone has anything on top of their head. Perhaps if you don't, maybe folks could link to some examples in the chat. I'll pause for a second in case anyone knows something off the top of their head. I know that's a little bit specific in the moment. Anyone? Yeah, okay. Go ahead, Fan.
Josh, one quick example. We did a story about it about a month ago, which, there's all this talk about planting trees to help absorb carbon and slow down global warming. And it can be an effective method. But we had a correspondent based in Cape Town, South Africa, who wrote about some of the African tree planting efforts that, in fact, were either a form of greenwashing or not that effective. That was one story. So, but anyway, I'll go into the chat. There are other things that come to mind.
Okay, terrific. Craig Bettenhausen asks, when writing about technical solutions such as carbon capture, how do you find the third-party experts who can be skeptical and pragmatic without dismissing the idea outright? And there was a similar comment, or relatively similar comment in the chat about how, forgive me for I don't have it right in front of me, so forgive me if I don't capture this exactly right, but readers had read about lithium mining And as a result, we're turned off from the idea of EV purchases. And I think both of these are somewhat related in that sort of technical solutions, they're not free. They all come with consequences. And so how do you sort of weigh all these things against each other, find experts who can talk about them meaningfully, and leave the audience with an understanding and not just a sense of, forget it, I'm just going to go back and do whatever I was doing?
I'll try to answer a little bit.
Go for it, Lindsay.
I don't cover these specific things that you're asking about very often, so maybe one of the other two people can talk about that. But I do think that this is a really good question that gets at, I think, a lot of the problems with how we sort of have typically reported on, especially on climate change and environmental issues, is like when something big happens, you know, they're like, everyone writes about it. Like we were saying, Aldean Charles is the example of climate migration, or like electric vehicles and like the policies around that is the example of like the biggest thing that can change the most. And it's like, it's just really overwhelming and also usually not all the way true. And there's just a lot of context within that. And so I think really deciding carefully and intentionally who we're asking to talk about how they'll be impacted. Like we always want to find people to like drive your narrative in these stories. But really looking at like, what ways will they be impacted and how can they tell their own version of that, right? Like the people in Cancer Alley that Neela was talking about know exactly what's happening to them. They might not have the science to back it up or be considered an expert by any means, but they like of the traditional sense, but they know that people are dying, that people are sick, that things are happening. And so really kind of reconfiguring who we think of as experts in the sense of who whatever thing is like nuclear power is harming and who it is benefiting. And in the case of carbon capture, same thing, right? So in addition to finding, researchers and making sure those researchers are diverse and not all white men, because they'll talk at you forever when you email them, then really making sure that that we're also talking to people on the ground, and to, not just like kind of as a monolith being like, these are all activists, because that's not always the case. It's people with like lived experience. And so we kind of divide those two with like scientists and activists. So really looking more deeply at who we consider experts, I think is a big way to help that coverage.
Thank you.
I mean,
go ahead, Neil.
Oh no, but just the other thing too, like, I get where the questioner is coming from, is that, you get some kind of press release, it looks interesting, and you just don't know if this is real or not. And I think part of it is that as a journalist, like if you're preparing to cover certain things, I mean, like the whole question about lithium and mining and EVs and all of that, that's really interesting. And the Times recently did a story about that, in fact, looking at the issues around it. I mean, what I did as a reporter was that I read a lot. I looked for the people who sound reasonable, who sound measured, and if they were academics or other experts, I would look up the work that they did, and then they became people I called, and so it's part of it is that you have to do a little bit of initial groundwork. You have to do a little bit of homework to figure out who are the people that you want to talk to, and you just approach them with that kind of humility, like, I don't really know a lot about this, and keep asking hard questions, and you're not going to get all of your questions answered. You've raised important questions about, lithium and EVs and batteries and all of that, and all the questions aren't answered yet, and that's okay. Those are things that we should be grappling with if we're going to be transparent about climate solutions.
Well, terrific. Neela, I'm going to give you the last word there. We're at time. I know there are more questions. I know there's really a fabulous chat happening. This whole webinar is being recorded and will be posted on ksjhandbook.org, where you can also get the entire handbook and download that. Sorry, let me just share my screen here. Just a little thank you note here at the end. Thank you to the three of you for participating in this. It was really terrific. Once this is posted online, you'll also be able to see the chat on ksj.org. It's ksjhandbook.org with this video. So again, Fen, Neela, Lindsay, thank you. All the attendees, thank you. The next webinar will be June 17th, and it's going to focus on COVID and healthcare, a topic you may be familiar with. And for those of you who attended, watch your email. There'll be a certificate of attendance and a survey for us. And again, thank you. Have a great day. Stay safe, stay healthy. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.